We've already mentioned a little bit that in poetry,
Արդեն նշեցինք, որ պոեզիայի մեջ
there is what is called parallelism.
Պարալելիզմ կոչված մի հասկացություն կա,
And by Jewish categories, the book of Psalms and the book of Proverbs are poetry.
իսկ հրեական հասկացողությամբ Արակած գիրքը եւ Proverbs and Psalms Սաղմոսներն ու Արակած գիրքը պոեզիա են.
But you'll also find that the book of Lamentations
Երեմիայի ողբերը
is also considered as poetry.
Նույնպես օգտագործվում է
because it's really in poetic form. Written by a prophet, but in poetic form. Song of Solomon is also in poetic form. So what I'm going to say about parallelism can be true of any of the books that the Jewish people considered as poetry. And that's part of what makes it poetry. In their approach, Job is also considered poetry. So you will find parallelisms in the book of Job as well. A parallelism always has two parts. And the two parts relate to each other in a distinct way. If you want to open Proverbs 19 verse 5, and you see what's called synonymous parallelism. That's when both parts really say the same thing. But the second part just restates it in a different way. A false witness will not go unpunished. So those people that tell lies will be punished. Second one, he who breathes out lies will not escape. You lie, you get punished. Same thing, just said in different ways. So the second part is just a restatement or a saying in other words of the first part. And the second kind is antithetical, or contrasting. Parallelism with a contrast. The second line is a contrast with the first. Okay. Proverbs 12:15. Bad example in the first half, good example in the second half. The way of a fool is right in his eyes.
Just a second.
Okay.
But
a wise man listens to advice. Do you see the contrast? Bad example. Both of them are discussing how open a person is to advice and to teaching. The fool, he doesn't want any instruction because he thinks he's right. The wise man is open to advice and instruction. So if you taught on that verse, your overall opinion would be about the question, how do you relate to advice? Are you so sure that you're right, you won't listen? Or are you open to learn, and so you'll take advice? It's all about dealing with advice. Then there is what's called synthetic parallelism. The In synonymous parallelism, you just have a repetition in different words in the second half. In contrasting parallelism, the second part is the very opposite of what's said in the first part. And here the second part just adds another idea or another nuance or some more information about what was talked about in the first passage. Okay, you can look at Proverbs 14:27.
14:27.
So the first part, the fear of the Lord is the fountain of life, for fearing God brings life. Now the second one doesn't restate it, doesn't give a contrast. It just adds more about the purpose or the consequence of this. Fear of the Lord gives life, so that people could turn away from death. First one just talks about the source of life. Second one talks about how to avoid death. So always the thing to remember is in parallelism, there's always two parts. And you have to analyze how does the second part fit with the first part. Does it restate the first part? Does it contrast with the first part? Or does it add more details than were in the first part? So you need to be sensitive to those as you get that in your mind. You'll be reading through Proverbs and go, oh, that's a synonymous. That's a contrast. That's a supplemental. There is also another kind called emblematic. Now, in this one, the difference is not in the content, but in the form. Proverbs 10:26. And what you have in these is, in the first half, there's figurative language. In the second half, there's literal. And there's normally a comparison here. Okay. Like vinegar to the teeth, smoke to the eyes. So they're both irritating. Smoke irritates your eyes. Vinegar makes your teeth feel bad. So there's a negative effect here. So is the lazy person to the one who sent him. So the lazy person brings pain to the one who has sent him to do a job. Just like smoke irritates your eyes, vinegar hurts your teeth. So the lazy person causes pain to the one who sent him. So once again, you'll see in the other ones that we looked at, it was literal. First part literal language, second part literal language. And this one, first part is figurative language, second part is literal. Now, don't worry. The synonymous parallelism is the most frequent. And then the contrasting. And then the one that has a little more. This kind is more rare. You're normally going to see like or as in the middle or some comparison. In terms of content, it's like a synonymous parallelism. First part, second part, talking about the same thing. Just talks about it in literal language or figurative language. The two big things you have to do, keep in mind, dealing with parallelism, is number one, what is said in the second part. Number two, how does that second part relate to the first part? And then number three, what do they mean when you put them together? So, but when it's all said and done, you want to take both parts together and summarize the meaning of that based upon both parts and the way they relate to each other. It's you're intuitively, if you've been reading the Bible for a while, you're intuitively sensing these two parts and their connections. When you read a verse in Proverbs, you just didn't know what to call it. But these are structures that are designed to help you better understand what the writer wanted you to understand. Understandable, not understandable, more or less. Okay. I didn't get the last.
Երկու բառերների two parallels. So I will surely pay more attention to the second part.
No, there's two parts. And you're paying attention most of all to the relationship between the two parts. How are they connected? How do they? Is it just a restatement of the first part? Is it a contrast with the first part? Is it adding more information about the first part?
Like a combination.
Exactly. Exactly right word. It's a combination. So you don't want to build your whole idea and say, okay, what's said in the first part is what this verse says.
I think
yes, but you better read the second part to understand it fully. Now, when I say contrast between the first and second part, I don't mean contradiction. I don't mean that there's one truth in the first part and there's another truth in the second part. That's not what's happening. They're two parts of one truth. They do not contradict each other. They in some way complement each other. Either to be able to say it in another way so you understand better, or to help you understand what was said in the first place, contrast, or to understand the first part in more detail. So you just have to keep the two parts together. Look how they relate to each other. And together they convey a certain truth to you. Մազգիզա կիպելս։
Այսինքն արդյոք եթե կոնտեքստ չկա,
there's no context.
Արդյոք վտանգավոր չէ օրինակ համար 19-րդ գլուխ 5-րդ համարը,
like let's say 5. So we'd say this verse.
Ու քարոզել.
And which one? Isn't that hermeneutic code gymnastics doing something like that? Because he was imagining things and
no, because there is a content in that verse. It means something. It It means something. You're just not making up something. And this parallelism is designed to communicate something to you. It just doesn't communicate like a letter of Paul does.
Օրինակ այս 19-5 դասախոսը ինչ բան կանի, այս parallel-ները ինքը ոնց բան կանի, ինչ կոմբինացիա կանի,
how would you combine it?
Ինքը ոնց կասի, եթե կարելի է, այլ
what would you tell about this if you want to
lying brings bad consequences. Lying brings punishment.
Սուտ խոսելը վատ հետևանքներ ա։
Now, would I preach just on that one verse?
Արդյոք միայն այս խոսքից կքարոզեի այս մի համարից։
No. I would find other verses in Proverbs that talk about lying or talk about telling the truth. And I would combine them together. Because in Proverbs, you're also going to see the opposite side where it will talk about God punishes liars. Here. Other places will say that God loves those who tell the truth. General conclusion? Be careful with what you say, because God knows whether you're lying or telling the truth. So, all of these are, you have to interpret them in the context of, like here, where there's the punishment or the won't escape. It's not talking about human punishment, it's talking about this is God, because it all assumes God's activity in the world. But one verse in Proverbs typically is 1 point. And you need to gather other verses to understand all that's said about that.
Եթե մտածես թեմատիկ քարոզ, լավ է առակացրել
preach a topical sermon. Yeah, it's good.
It's good
to preach from Proverbs. Like Proverbs is a viable option.
If you're preaching at a youth conference, you might want to use Proverbs. To give them advice for making decisions. You want to talk about making decisions as a young person? You've got a lot of good material in Proverbs. That you pull 3 or 4 verses out. Now, you're still going to come back and you're going to study each of these verses. What the words mean, etc. Exegetica you still do. You still do an exegetica, but just on each individual verse. With the difference. In your typical exegesis, you're looking a lot at context. Here we don't have a context. Which makes them, preaching Proverbs is easy to do badly. It's harder to do well. To be honest, most people, if they're going to preach a topical sermon on Proverbs, they're going to need to use commentaries more than they usually do. Because biblical experts can help us understand the meaning of those individual proverbs better. So, if you read English, like I said, if you can read English, Tim Keller has a wonderful book on Proverbs. If you can even get it in electronic format and drop it over in that translator into Armenian, it'd be worth doing. Because he does a really good job.
Translate
he does a really good job of pulling of doing basically thematic sermons in each chapter.
Այսինքն ամեն գլխում ինքը տալիս է ոնց որ թեմատիկ
He
քարոզ,
pulls in all kinds of verses from Proverbs.
որտեղ տարբեր խոսքեր է հավաքում իրար հետ, ներողություն,
In terms of comparing different verses in Proverbs to each other,
տարբեր համարներ իրար հետ համատելու առումով,
Keller's book already has done a lot of the work for you.
շատ գործ արդեն
At least you know, okay, which verses do I need to read and compare with each other. He gives you a start, basically. And he's the one that I like the best right now in terms of thematic interpretation of But you are right. Most of the book of Proverbs you can only preach if you do thematic sermons. I knew of a small group and they were trying to study verse by verse through Proverbs. It was crazy because they had a lot of fun discussing everything. But they wanted to send people home with an idea. The Savshini. They couldn't. It was like north, south, east, west. It was bouncing all over. Now, one thing you can do to help yourself, there's 31 chapters of Proverbs. You can take a month. You can read one chapter a day. And in a month, you will finish the whole book of Proverbs. But you make yourself a note about the themes that you encounter. So you take a piece of paper or you take a block note. You start with chapter 1. Chapter 1, okay, what themes, when a theme comes up in chapter 1, you write down chapter 1, verses 1 through whatever. The theme that's discussed. Now, it works better if you have a little physical notebook. Then you get to a new theme. You pick another page, clean page. Write that theme at the top of your page. Write down which verses talk about it. You go to the second chapter. If it discusses a theme that you've already written down in your little book, just make a note. These verses in chapter 2 talk about this theme too. And by the time you spend a month going through that, you already have your own thematic summary of Proverbs. And you want to preach on one of those themes? Go back to your little notebook. Open it up to that theme. Go through and pick a few of the verses. Build a sermon around it. But it's better to take a month. You can take 2 months and just read through Proverbs. You can make that same kind of. I think it's just convenient if you have a physical notebook. You can do the same thing in your computer file. The benefit of the computer file is you can actually copy and paste those verses. Here's your heading, Zaglavia. Here's the verses you found. Now further, there's another theme. Benefit of the computer is then you can just go back and quickly reread all those verses. But to preach well on Proverbs, you need to really walk through it and figure out where it talks about what themes. You can do that with the search function in your computer programs. But it will give you a better overview of Proverbs if you intend to preach on Proverbs in the future. At least once in your life, you should walk through Proverbs and thematic summary.
Արակածը ու ինքդ քո ամփոփումը անես վերլուծությունը։
Now, we're going to walk right through in just a minute, and we're going to talk about how you develop a thematic sermon.
Հիմա խոսել ենք թե ինչպես կառուցել թեմատիկ քարոզ։
But here, when you're working with Proverbs,
Այստեղ երբ աշխատում ենք առակների հետ,
if that proverb has some cultural nuances or details in it,
մշակութային նյուանս կամ
you're going to have to explain that to your people.
Դա արժի քո ժողովրդին բացատրել։
What did this word mean? How was it used?
Բառը ինչպես է օգտագործվել։
Especially how was this word used in poetic books of the Bible?
Մանավանդ թե ինչպես են օգտագործում Աստվածաշնչի պոետիկ գրքերում։
That's another advantage of if you're using my Bible.
My Bible at the Apple guide.
And you open up the dictionary function. You click on the Strong's number.
Strongy numberness.
And it will tell you how that Hebrew word was used in different places and what it meant. And it will actually have the verses listed there. Bible Zoom will also do that.
Bible Zoom,
just don't try to use Bible Zoom in Western Europe. You can't get to it. Since it's a Russian program, they block it. Don't like that. I like Bible Zoom. Okay, when you're preaching Proverbs, please preach it as God's wisdom for life. Don't preach it as just common sense or народная мудрость or something like that. It is the inspired word of God. It's God's advice on if you want to be wise, do this. If you want to be wise, if you do this, you're not wise. You don't preach it as guarantees or as absolutes. And you really need to try to tie the advice given in Proverbs to the gospel. They don't tell you how to be saved. They tell you how to live as a saved person. So even if we're talking about lying and telling the truth, we want to tie that back to Jesus. Okay. And since Proverbs shows what God likes and dislikes, what is valuable to him, what is not valuable to him, remind people about what it teaches us about God. We're talking about liars will be punished. Why? Because God hates lies. God values the truth. God values truthfulness. And so he punishes those, or he tends to punish those who lie. So you won't get a lot of direct teaching about God in the Proverbs. But they do. Wisdom is that which is pleasing to God. Foolishness is that which is not pleasing to God. So when you see wisdom in the book of Proverbs, you have a revelation of God's priorities, of God's heart. When you see foolishness, you see that which is not pleasing to God. So they do teach us about God, but not directly, like in a or some other form.
Are
you confused yet?
Sure.
Okay.
Yes. So it's good.
Okay. It's good. Proverbs again and again also has a more individualistic approach. Most of the Proverbs talk about the choices the person makes
Արաբների մեծամասնությունը խոսում են մարդու կատարած ընտրության մասին։
So, in many ways,
Շատ առումներով
what you're wanting to say when you're preaching the Proverbs is,
ինչ ես ուզում ասես,
this is what you, Hovnan, should do, not we, the group, should do.
Ինչ պիտի անես, ոչ թե մենք որպես խումբ։
Now, that doesn't mean that we can ignore that.
Դա չի նշանակում, որ կարող ենք անտեսել դա։
But Proverbs again and again highlights personal accountability before God.
Կրկին ու կրկին առակասը նշում է, անձնական պատասխանատվություն։
So people should walk away from hearing a sermon on Proverbs feeling like,
Մարդիկ առակացի շուրջ քարոզ լսելիս պիտի գնան,
I am responsible before God for how I live.
Ես պատասխանատու եմ Աստծո առաջ, թե ինչպես եմ ապրում։
And you need to call people to apply what you're talking about.
Պիտի կոչեք մարդկանց, որպեսզի կիրառեն այն ինչ որ լսել են։
Proverbs were not written for reflection or for information.
Նրանք չեն գրվել, որ ուղղակի դրա շուրջը
They were written so that people would live wisely.
Գրվել են սրանք, որպեսզի մարդիկ իմաստությամբ ապրեն։
You can't just pick a proverb and go,
Չես կարող վերցնես
that's nice.
լավ
Proverbs are right here, and they say, stop it, do this. They're designed to be applied.
Իրենց նպատակն է, որ կիրառված լինեն։
All of Scripture is designed to be applied.
Ամբողջ խոսքն է գրված, որ
The Proverbs is even more directly targeting
գիրքը ավելի կոնկրետ, խոսում է targets what?
It targets application.
Ավելի կոնկրետ խոսում է կիրառության մասն, ավելի շատ է կենտրոնացում այդ կիրառության վրա, քան ուրիշ բաների։
Preach topical sermons from Proverbs,
Կարող ես քարոզել
not just individual sayings.
Թեմատիկ քարոզներ, հենց ուրեմն առակած գրքից։
And make sure if there's a negative thing expressed about a theme in Proverbs and a positive,
Հասարակական բան կապված թեմայի մասին, ինչպես նաև դրական,
the good wife, the bad wife,
լավ կինը ու վատ կինը,
listening to advice, not listening to advice.
Խորհրդին լսել, խորհրդին չլսել,
Make sure for balance you include both of those.
վստահ եղեք, որ բալանսի համար երկուսն ներառվեն։
Now there are a few
Կան մի քանիսը
larger sections of Proverbs.
մի քանի մեծ գաղափարներ, ուրեմն
First chapter, last chapter, some in the middle,
առաջի գլուխը, վերջի գլուխը, որոշ գլուխներ մեջտեղում,
and those you can preach like you would a typical expository sermon.
Սրանք կարող ես քարոզել որպես
You just walk through it,
քարոզ,
see where the natural structure is in that,
գնում ես հերթականություն, տեսնես թե ինչպեսին է
summarize your big ideas, summarize your subject,
նական գաղափարն ես ամփոփում,
summarize your call to action.
Եվ կոչը,
But most of Proverbs should be taught in a topical sermon format.
Առակների մեծամասնությունը պիտի սովորեցվեն հենց թեմատիկ ձևով։
Now we're going to look at one block
Այլանք մի բլոկ,
where there is a structure inside of it.
որտեղ առակած գրքում, որտեղ ունենք կառուցվածք։
So we're going to look at chapter 1,
Այլանք առաջի գլուխը,
verses 1 through 7.
1-ից 7 խոսքեր։
Let's read that.
Կարդանք։ 7 included,
Yes.
1-ից 7։
Yeah. 1 through 7.
Իսրայելի թագավորի Դավթի որդի Սողոմոնի առակները։ Իմաստությունն ու խրատը ճանաչելու, խորաթափանց խոսքերը հասկանալու, իմաստության, արդարության, իրավունքի ու ուղղության խրատն ընդունելու համար, որպեսզի պարզամիտերին խորագիտություն տա, երիտասարդներին գիտություն ու խոնարհություն։ Իմաստունը պիտի լսի եւ ավելացնի իր ուսումը, եւ հասկացող մարդն իմաստուն խորհուրդներ պիտի ստանա։ Առարկն ու մեկնությունը իմաստունների ասույթներն ու նրանց խրթաբանությունները հասկանալու համար։ Իմաստության սկիզբը Տիրոջ երկյուղն է, սակայն անմիտներն արամարում են իմաստությունն ու խրատը։
Okay. Where does it start? What does it say in verse 1?
Ինչ է ասում առաջին համարում։
Առաջին համարում։
Okay. Now, this is an introduction to one section of Proverbs.
Առակած գլխի մի հատվածի ներածությունը։
Because if you read the whole book, you'll find out not all the Proverbs are Proverbs of Solomon.
Եթե կարդաս ամբողջ գիրքը կհասկանաս, որ բոլոր առակները չի որ Սողոմոնինն է։
In this section of Proverbs, this is the introduction to this section of
Սա կոնկրետ այս հատվածին նախաբանն ներածությունը։
It does introduce the purpose of Proverbs,
Ներկայացնում է նրանց նպատակը,
which applies to all Proverbs regardless of author.
որը վերաբերում է բոլոր առակներին, կապ չունի
But verse 1 should not be taken to say all the Proverbs in the book of Proverbs were written by Solomon.
Առաջի խոսքը չպիտի վերցնենք, որպեսզի հասկանանք, որ բոլոր առակները Սողոմոնն է գրել։
Because that's not what it says later. Later it will say different author.
Հետագայում ասում է, որ ուրիշ հեղինակներ կան։
So we basically start reading here until we find in the book of Proverbs where it says these are the Proverbs of in this group.
Ինչև տեսնում ենք, որ սրանք ուրիշ մեկի, հա, Սողոմոնի առակներն են։
Okay. What do verses 2 and 3 talk about?
Ինչի մասն է խոսում երկրորդ ու երրորդ համարները։
Ինչի համարա։
Ինչի մասն է խոսում։
Ինչի համարա գրվել։
Why were they written for?
Okay, the purpose of the writing.
Նպատակը իրենց գրվել է։
In your translation, does verse 4 continue discussing why they were written?
Չորրորդը արդյոք շարունակում է խոսել իրենց նպատակի մասին։ Yes.
Okay. Okay. Verse 5, the form changes a little, right?
Գրելու ձևը փոխվում է, չէ՞ մի փոքր։
It's more of a call to action.
Ավելի գործի համախոհ չէ՞ իմաստուն։
Listen to these and there will be this result.
Լսիր սրան եւ կլինի այս։
So one is just an introduction to this section of the book. 2, 3, 4 express the purpose of the Proverbs. 5 and 6 call them to action. And then 7 is kind of another summary statement. A warning that you're not going to understand these proverbs unless you fear the Lord. This is why they were written. A call to use them to live a good godly life. And then a qualification or a warning in 7. You have to fear the Lord, but in order to learn. And a warning that some people are not going to want to learn. And verse 7 even sets up the whole structure of the rest of the book. Fearing God, you will have wisdom. But if you're foolish, you'll just despise wisdom and discipline. Okay. If you were going to preach on this, what's a possible theme that you could use?
Talking about wisdom.
About what?
Like wisdom.
Yes. Yeah. How to live wisely, maybe, right? Okay. Or learning to live wisely. So then you walk through, you talk about how wisdom, how these proverbs can help you with wisdom. Then you challenge people to seek wisdom.
մարդկանց քաջել էր մարտահրավեր ես նետնում։
And then in verse 7, you warn them
Իմաստություն գտնեն
to fear God and not turn away seeking. And the upper verses in that first block, in order to learn how to live wisely, we must consider how God would have us live. It talks about gaining wisdom there. To learn to live wisely, we must and in the end, we must
take
something. Let's see. I always did this die again. I lost it. Not spare. It's right. Okay. So continue.
Դարձախոսի նկարը չի բացել։
Recording in progress. We're back. Okay. Okay. Yep. We're back. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. Okay. That's how you basically would prepare a sermon on one of those logical blocks. In verse 8, you start having another block starts. And the next block, starting verse 8, is about listening to your mother and father's advice and how to turn away from temptation. So, and it pretty much runs down through most of the rest of chapter 1. Now, from memory or through looking in your search function on your computer, I want you to think about what are some verses that talk about child or child rearing. You're going to have to search by the word child. We already quoted one of them. Train up a child in the way she should go. Another classic one, spoil the rod and spare the rod and spoil the child.
Spare?
Yeah, don't. In other words, don't punish and you'll ruin your kid. Предупреждайте его дисциплину, и вы будете повредить своему ребенку. Okay. Other words with the word child in it in Proverbs. Can you think of any? And if you're doing a search, you want to search exclusively in the book of Proverbs. So set your search function to where it's only searching in Proverbs.
Current book.
Yep, current book. And see if what we can find about child. Yeah, mine immediately found 5.
It's like
you also
lots of Bible is banner.
in
No,
I'm reading it.
this is NLT. I've searched them.
Okay.
How many good Bana ախպեր են My Bible-ը ունես չէ։ Ատե բացա հիմա կոմպյուտերը։
Օտերան post տալու։
I'll just
Սա
Okay, give me an example of someone that you found.
Այսինչ որ կոմենտարիներ ես բացել, թե հիմա դա պիտի գրես խոսքի երեխա, ասենք այդ հայրն ես գրում։ Բայց նայես դա վսյա բիբլիա գրած, ոնց որ պիտի նասրոք եկը փոխես, ձեկուշյա կնիգա, հիմա մի հատ դասալ չարա, չէ, պոստը սրճ։
Ներեք, որ համարն եք նայեմ իմ մոտ կախում էր։
Ապել բաները, My Bible ունես,
Չիտի ու մինյա։
Մարտուն։
Okay.
Այդ My Bible-ով search-ը գիտես չէ, ոնց օգտվել։
Okay. For instance, in mine, it has Proverbs 22:6.
22:6, yes. 22:15.
Ահա,
23:13. And 20:11.
Okay, mine has 2011 and 29:15.
I'll just 1 second. Ատաղ ախպեր, պրոստը երեխա բառն ենք հիմա
Ինչից
խնդրում։
օգտվել։
It's lag. He's so behind. Ախպեր նայ այդ search-ը գիտես չէ ոնց անել։ My Bible-ում Մարտուն
Լսում եմ։
My Bible. I don't think the connect. Առակած գրքում, ոնց որ ֆիլտրը նենց դնում, որ առակած գրքում բերի մենակ պատկերացրիր։
Okay, and what you would do then, I would read the
Love
I would read. Okay, and like I have 22:6, 22:15, 23:13, 29:15. Especially if I wanted to, if the thing that's addressed in 22:15, 23:13,
and in Shemasor,
and 29:15 is the necessity of disciplining your children.
երեխային, ուրեմն երեխային դաստիարակելու մասն է խոսքը։
22:15 explains why discipline is necessary.
Ներկայացնում է թե ինչու է կարգապահությունը անհրաժեշտ։
It says there's foolishness in the heart of a child,
Հիմարություն կա, հա երեխա։
and discipline drives it out. So
Կարգապահությունը դա դուրս է հանում։
So why do we need to discipline?
Ինչու է անհրաժեշտ կարգապահություն։
Because children have foolishness.
Երեխաներ ունեն
They have a lack of, and foolishness is not knowing how to live or not wanting to live the way God wants.
Ու դա բանա որ նա չես ուզում ապրես ինչպես։
So we discipline them
Ոստի մենք իրենց կարգապահություն ենք ենթադրում, հա, որպեսզի օգնենք ավելի իմաստուն ապրել։
Okay. 23:13 basically says, and if you discipline him, it's not going to kill him. First one says discipline is necessary for development. 23:13 says discipline will not damage the child. And then 29:15 says, but if you don't discipline your child, you will damage him. So the first one says, why? Because it's in the heart of the child.
խնդիր կա հայ երեխայի սրտում։
2 says, okay,
Երկրորդ ասում է
but what if it's dangerous to him?
ինչ եթե
That says,
տանգավոր է։
discipline
Պատասխանային է որ ոչ,
will not damage him.
չէ, կարգապահությունը քեզ վնաս չի տա։
29:15 says, but if you don't discipline him,
29-15 ասում է եթե չկարգապահ
he will not grow up to
չի
be the
ենթարկես,
kind of person that you or the Lord want.
այսպեսի մարդ չի լինի որ դու կամ Աստված ասում
So, why bother with disciplining your children?
ինչու դաստիարակել երեխաներին։
They need it.
Նրանց պետք է դա,
It's good for them,
այդ լավ է իրենց համար,
and you keep them from developing into bad people.
իրենց կանխում է սա վատ մարդ դառնալուց պոտենցիալ։
Now, in many cultures, you'd have to explain what does discipline mean, what does rod mean, those types of things.
Աստիարակել նշանակում ինչը գավազան է, այսպիսի բաներ,
But you're not inventing a structure, not inventing a context.
բայց կոնտենտն ու կառուցվածքը չես
You're just reading each one of these proverbs
կարդում ես
that talk about discipline,
որ խոսում է կարգապահության
and
մասին։
then you're trying in one sentence to summarize what each one of them teaches us about discipline.
Փորձում ես ամփոփել թե ինչ ասում։
And then you summarize it all. I would summarize it to say,
Ես ասես այն կամփոփեի ասելով
parents who really love and want to help their children will discipline them.
որ ծնողները ովքեր սիրում են իրենց երեխաներին կդաստիարակեն նրանց։
So do you understand the process?
Հասկանում եք չես process-ը։
Now, you may have to look for synonyms sometimes.
Միգուցե երբեմն արժի տեսնել թե ինչ հոմանիշներ կան։
You're looking for wife. You don't want to talk about marriage.
Այլն կուզում ես ամուսնության մասին։
You might have to search for wife.
Կարելի է
You might have to search for woman.
Same word in
Okay. Yeah, that's right.
Ոնց որ կին ամուսին, հա, դա ու
you might have to search for marriage.
Ու ամուսնություն, օրինակ այդ բառը։
Or you might have to search, is husband a different word than man?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
You might have to search for husband.
Օրինակ ամուսին։
So you might have to use all of the words that you know of that are connected to marriage.
Այսինքն search անես բոլոր բառերը, որ կապված են, հա, ամուսնության հետ։
And you have to search for you search for all of those
Որոնես այդ բոլորը
to get the overall teaching about marriage in there.
Դրանց միջոցով ընդհանուր ամուսնության մասին ուսուցում վերցնես։
So your electronic search function on your computer is your best friend.
Այդ search-ի
When you're trying to do a topical sermon on.
Քո լավագույն ընկերն է, հա, այդ search-ը, երբ որ ուզում ես թեմատիկ քարոզ պատրաստես։
You're probably going to find more verses than you could use.
Ավելի շատ խոսքեր կգտնես քան թե որ կօգտագործես։
So you pick the very best ones.
Լավագույններն ես ընտրում։
And what do you do?
Թեմայի հետ կապված։ Հետո ինչ ես անում։
Well, you go back and you read each one of them
Կարդում ես բոլորը
multiple times in multiple translations.
մի քանի անգամ, մի քանի թարգմանություններով։
You study what the various words might mean in there using your dictionaries and your Strong's numbers.
Բառարանը ու strong-ի թվերը օգտագործում ես թե բառերը ինչ են։
You study each one by looking it up in a commentary.
Մեկնության մեկնաբանության մեջ նայելով։
And then you come back and you summarize what each verse means.
Հետո ամփոփում ես հասկանալով թե յուրաքանչյուր խոսք ինչ է նշանակում։
Other than context, you're doing the same thing you would with any expository.
Անում ես նույն բաները ինչ որ կաներ օրինակ բացատրական քարոզի մեջ։
Okay. Understand?
It's not that case.
մի քանի գլխավոր միտք չի լինելու, չէ՞։
Then there is no.
Համարներից մի միտք պետք է հավաքես ասես։
It's just one main thought in all of those different verses, so you kind of gather it in one big theme, thought, and then you teach them.
Yep.
Let's say we found this 5 verses. So child needs to be disciplined. 5 verses teach them. We see all those teachings directly and indirectly in all of those verses.
Yep. What you do then also, what you're really doing, you're using an inductive process rather than a deductive process.
Deductive.
Inductive moves from details to summary.
Ինդուկտիվը այսինքն դետալներից գալիս է ամփոփմանը, հա, ոնց որ
So you're looking at all these different verses
տարբեր խոսքերին
as individual verses,
որպես ինդիվիդուալ անհատական,
and then you're coming to a general summary statement
գալիս է ընդհանուր ամփոփման
that summarizes what is said.
բոլոր խոսքերը ինչպես.
But your individual verses wind up being individual points in your sermon.
Այդ առանձին խոսքերը կետեր են, պունկտեր են դառնում, ուղղակի քարոզի մեջ.
I'm not telling you this will be a simple thing to do.
Չեմ ասում որ սա բարձ է լինելու.
If you're going to prepare a good thematic sermon on Proverbs,
եթե ուզում ես լավ թեմատիկ քարոզ
you may need a month. Especially if there are a lot of verses that talk about that. Just reading those verses, understanding them, praying that God would help you select the right verses. You can't have 12 verses in there. You should not. You should not have more than 5 verses from 5 separate proverbs. Or you've got, Kasha Galabia. I heard one sermon in Krakow, unfortunately. This guy had 7 points. His one point had 24 subpoints. And he read 2 verses per subpoint. So he basically read 60 different verses from the Bible in one sermon. And I did not stay around after the service. I was afraid he would come up and say, "What did you think of my sermon?" I don't know him well enough to tell him the truth about that sermon. We need to drink a lot more coffee before I could be honest about that sermon. The best I could have said was, you had a lot of biblical content. And you picked a good theme. That's the best I could have said. So I just turned and shook hands with a lot of other people and kind of snuck out the back. Now, with you guys, I know you better. If you did that, I could say, let's sit down for 2 hours and let's talk about how you could do that better next time. I could not have that. Now, I want us to go back. We've talked about 2 types of genres today. What kind were they?
Narrative.
Poetic.
Poetry.
Poetry, Proverbs. Proverbs are a type of poetry. Psalms are another type of poetry. They have some things in common and they have some. Proverbs were not made to be sung. So the individual words in a proverb are much more important than the individual words in a psalm. Psalms are designed to paint a big picture and to produce an emotional and, the word volitional, where it's through will, and volitional response. Proverbs do not have a lot of emotional content. They're targeting your mind and your life. They're a head, hands genre. Psalms is heart, moving to head, producing work with your hands. But it starts with your emotions. Proverbs start with your head.
Արաքած սկսում է գլխից
Don't involve hardly any emotion
չի ներառում ոչ մի
and produce action.
գործողություն է
So-
ներառել
You just need to know what they're designed for.
Մենք պետք է հասկանալ թե ինչի համար են իրենք
If you have in your toolkit a hammer
եթե ունես
and a screwdriver,
ու atvertka
отвертка и молоток,
ու չակոչ
okay?
մուրճ
I wouldn't suggest, these chairs, there are screws, right?
բան ունես շեմ ինչ աննա
And you need to fix them.
պատուտակ համարսի ու
Are you going to use the отвертка or are you going to use the молоток?
չես անելու ծեր մուրճով կխփես թե կձգես atvertkով
Don't use the hammer.
չարժի
You'll break the whole thing.
կջարդես
Use the screwdriver.
տակրծում ես atvertkեն
But you have to know what the tool is designed for.
պիտի իմանաս թե ինչի համար է գործիք է նախատեսված
Same thing with proverbs, same thing with narratives.
նույն բանը նարատիվների հետ եւ առակների
You need to remember, okay, what was this type of literature designed to do?
Պիտի հասկանանք թե ինչի համար է նախատեսված այսպիսի այս ժանրը
Narratives, what do you think?
նարատիվները ինչ է
Head, heart, or hands?
գլուխ սիրտ
Or in what order?
ձեռքեր
Most important, second important, third important.
կամ ավելի առաջնահերթությամբ
Told you proverbs
Yes.
is head, hands.
չէ օրինակ խոսքը գնաց առակները
Told you psalms are heart, head, hands.
կամ սամոսները սիրտ գլուխ ձեռքեր
How about narratives?
նարատիվների մասին
It depends on the narrative.
նարատիվից է կախված
Եթե սուցով հետ է մտածում, եթե սուցողական ներատիվ
narrative
այդ արդեն ոտի կալի
could be a leg
Yeah, it's kind of, I would say it's head, heart tied,
Ավելի գլուխն ու սիրտը իրար են միացած
because the narrative asks you,
նարատիվը քեզ հարց է տալիս
please understand what happened,
հասկացիր ինչ է տեղի ունեցել
but ask more of you than that.
բայց ավելի շատ բան է քեզնից պահանջում
It says, step into the narrative and feel what happened.
մտքի նարատիվի մեջ ու
Sense
զգա
what
ինչ է
happened.
կատարվում
Put yourself on the place in the place of these people.
մարդկանց տեղը դիր քեզ
But the ultimate goal is for it to transform
Վերջնական
your life.
նպատակը հնա որ քո կյանքը փոխի
So each one has their own nuance.
այսինքն ամեն մեկը իր առանձին նյուանսներն ունի
You're probably not going to get very emotional while even if you're an emotional person.
օրինակ նույնիսկ
You're not
եթե
going to get emotional preaching a sermon on Proverbs.
այդքան էմոցիոնալ չես լինի երբ որ առակացից
Unless it's just what's happening in your life. But the
քանի դար եթե
genre is not going to push you towards emotion.
կյանքի հետ բայց ժանրը ինքը քեզ էմոցիոնալ
Psalms will push
չի
you more
տա
towards emotions.
ինչը չես կարող ասես սալմոսների մասին որ քեզ էմոցիոնալ են դարձնում
Very analytical people love Proverbs.
ավելի վերլուծող մարդիկ սիրում են առակները
They don't like Psalms as well.
այդքան շատ սալմոսները չէ
Analytical people have trouble with narratives sometimes
դրանք մարդիկ երբեմն խնդիր ունեն նարատիվների հետ
because they want there to be more structure in that narrative than it's really there.
ուզում են ավելի շատ կառուցված կա ստրուկտուրա ավելացնել այդ նարատիվում քան թե դրված է այնտեղ
Creative people, they love the Psalms.
կրեատիվ մարդիկ սիրում են սալմոսները
They have a little bit of trouble with Proverbs.
մի քիչ խնդիր ունեն առակների հետ
And narratives,
նարատիվները
they're gonna immediately view that narrative differently.
միանգամից ուրիշ հայացքով կնայեն
They're gonna ask the question, how did Zacchaeus feel at that moment?
Սաքեոս ինչ է ինչպես է զգում այդ բանը
I hope that this is big thing is know what you're dealing with
կարևորը այն է որ հասկանաս թե ինչի հետ գործ ունես
and let that genre be that genre.
ու թույլ տալ ժանրին լինել այն ժանրը որը կա
Don't try to turn everything into the
Me-
book of Romans.
փորձիր ամեն գիրք դարձնել ռոմեացիների գիրք
Let the uniquenesses come out and see those uniquenesses as you study this passage.
ամեն յուրահատկություն ինքն իրեն ցույց տա հա երբ որ սովորում ես ուսումնասիրում ես հատվածը
If you study Proverbs not in a thematic way,
Եթե առակացը չսովորես թեմատիկ կերպով,
and you ignore the parallelisms in Proverbs,
or parallelismները, որ մասին
you
խոսացինք,
will misinterpret the Proverbs.
Սխալ կմեկնես։
You'll make them say what they never intended to say.
Դու այնպես կանես, որ ինքը ասեն մի բան, որ երբեք այդտեղ չկար։
Don't make them into guarantees. Don't make them into absolutes. Don't make them into commands. Let them be advice from God about how to live as a child of God. Don't make them recipes for salvation. And don't do what some secular people do. There are lost people that like the book of Proverbs. Because they say this is just good advice on how to be successful. No. The fear of the Lord is the beginning. The book of Proverbs was not designed to be practiced without a relationship with God, but in a relationship with God. Come back to that again and again.
My sign, so that expression is a lot in and it says about who's the father, who's the son, and then there's it talks about mom and dad, like who's dad, what family is this, like how.
And generally, I think it's your biological family. I think it's real. However, the relationship that's assumed in that is not just person who gave birth to you or man who was involved in the process of you being born. But it's talking about the teacher, learner. Although it's not the words used. In New Testament terms, it would be teacher, disciple. So don't ignore what this mentor, modern terms, tried to teach. Because of the dynamics of that relationship, it's more than just, it includes mom, dad, physical. But I think the truths in them, in those sections, apply to other relationships where you have an older person trying to train you. Don't ignore the advice of
I like it, it says.
And don't ignore the teachings of those people who've really tried to help you be better.
Because like New Testament, there's lots of places it says listen to your leaders.
Yeah, exactly. It's definitely always involves a relationship where one person is a little more mature spiritually. And they're impacting a less mature person. And they're trying to help this pupil, this disciple, grow and develop. And the tendency is for people to ignore good advice.
Քանի առակացում ենք կարելի է մի հարցել, հետաքրքիր է դասախոսը ոնց է մտածում։
How do you think about
բոլորիս հայտնի առակացության գլուխ
Proverbs 8
22-ից 31-րդ համարները
22-31 of these famous passages.
Ինչ է մտածում սրա մասին
22-31
And this is another one where it's a block.
Yeah,
The personification of wisdom.
անձնականացում այս վկաների կոնտեքստ հա չէ
եւ այլ չէ
իրենք են անասի օգտագործում
դասախոսը ոնց է մտածում այս հատվածի մասին արդյոք ինքը էսի տեսնում է մարգարեություն կամ ինչ-որ մի բան
This is a prophecy
I see it
Jesus
and once again because of other scriptures
ուրիշ հատվածների լույսի ներքո
it doesn't say this is Jesus
չի ասում որ սա Հիսուսն է
but what is said about wisdom
բայց ինչ որ
in other places is said about Jesus so I tend to interpret this as saying this was Jesus' role in these activities. If you're going to do your Christology of the Old Testament, it's a great text to show Jesus' role in creation. Although his name is not mentioned, you can easily defend that the things that are said about wisdom here are said about Jesus in other places. I think there's grounds for saying it's Jesus.
Եվ նորկտականում առաջի կոնտակտից հենց առաջի լուկ 30 համարում ասում է չէ որ Քրիստոսը մեզ համար դարձավ արդարություն եւ իմաստություն նաեւ սա է չէ
First Corinthians says Jesus became for us justice and righteousness and wisdom
Այս վերջում խոսում էինք մեկի հետ ոնց որ այս համարների մասին ասեցի ինքը չեն թվում որպես արգումենտ որ այս Հիսուսն է իսկ մի քանի համարներ
someone and that person they don't want to accept that this is talking about Jesus
yeah I think they have a point it doesn't say Jesus in the text but you don't have to have the word to have the concept there are places where concepts are discussed and ideas are discussed but the typical word we use for that concept or idea is not used there are other places where the right word is used but that passage doesn't discuss what we think it's discussing. Because the word isn't there doesn't mean that that's not what it's talking about. Because the word is there doesn't guarantee that that's what it's talking about. So we see many of these things here. And definitely, the New Testament definitely teaches that this world was created by Jesus. Jesus holds this world together. This world was created for Jesus. So what you would need to do if you're going to preach this as Jesus, you would have to use your New Testament parallels to show people this is why I came to the conclusion that this is Jesus. One of our challenges in preaching is if we really want people to think better and to read the Bible better, and I have to keep working on this after preaching already 45 years. I've been preaching for 45 years and I still have to work at this.
Oh yes, արդեն 43 տարի քարոզում եմ ու այլի պիտի աշխատեմ սրա վրա.
Tell them how you came to that conclusion, not just what conclusion you came to.
Ասեք մարդկանց թե ինչպես եք եկել.
We know this is Jesus, or I think this is Jesus.
Չասում եմ, ես մտածում եմ Հիսուսն է, բայց ինչու եմ
Or we can apply this way.
Կամ մենք կարող ենք կիրառել այս բանը այս կերպով որովհետև
this narrative can mean this because
նարատիվը կարող է
teaching us.
When
you're talking about disciplining the child, you can go to the New Testament, what's said in Ephesians, what's said in Peter's epistle, about disciplining the child, but also about discouraging the child. Those others can let's do a 10-minute break.
32 համարը ոնց որ հենց արդեն ցույց տա, չէ, ասում է ուսի հիմա որդիներ ինձ լսեք, քանի որ օրհնյալ են նրանք, ովքեր պահում են իմ ճամփաները։ Սողոմոնը չի կարա, չէ, ասի օրհնյալ են նրանք, ովքեր պահում են իմ ճամփաները։ Սա արդեն ոնց որ ցիտատը չի հենց Քրիստոսի։
Like Solomon doesn't say this, right? Isn't this a citation from Christ himself? All who follow my ways are joyful.
Yeah, it's definitely, in the context, it's talking about wisdom.
Կոնտեքստում ես խոսում է իմաստության մասին, հա։
And Solomon was wise, but he was not the personification of wisdom himself.
Սողոմոնը իմաստուն էր, բայց ինքը իմաստության մարմնավորումը չէր։
And so I think it's better here. You're either going to say this is wisdom, but say it's wisdom, it's a personification of wisdom. It's taking an inanimate thing and giving it animate qualities.
Այսինքն վերցնում են ինչ-որ չմարմնավորված բան եւ տալիս նրան մարմնավորում։
And whether you say it's Jesus or not Jesus, the whole call of this is to say, seek out wisdom. And that's where he ends in 35 and 36. Seek out wisdom. Once again, you have to go back what's been said previously. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So to find wisdom, you have to find it in a relationship with God. Okay, great questions. Let's take a 10-minute break. We'll be